Shalom, shalom, holy chevra. It's an honor and delight to be here with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Dov Rosen, who is the rabbi and director at Yakar Yerushalayim, wonderful shul in Jerusalem. Rabbi Rosen studied Torah at both modern and Haredi yeshivot for many years, a decade of which was at Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut in the Gush Etzion. He studied philosophy and literature at the Hebrew University, from which he received a doctorate in philosophy for a dissertation on the subject of the metaphysical and theological basis of social justice theory. Kabbalic. Okay, Rabbi Rosen, thank you for taking time to talk.
It's good to see you.
Okay, so to jump right in here, what is the role of the individual in determining ethical behavior? To most philosophers, it's such an absurd question, but we're committed to halacha. And so as traditional Jews who are committed to a legal tradition, a legal process, it raises the question of autonomy and the individual. So what is our role in determining our ethical choices?
Okay, well, this is big, right? So we'll throw something in. So like, you've got the idea of personality, and like the Kabbalistic or Hasidic ways to talk about a source of an origin, a source of a soul, right? A shoresh neshama, right? And then you can talk about personality and the idea that you have a shlichut, what Protestants will call a vocation and Jews will talk like a mission in life, right? And then of course, I think that the first question is it an objective mission, right? Is it something you're given or is it something you choose? And there, obviously, if it's something you choose, then, are you choosing right? Are you choosing wrong? Or are there many options and you're really choosing, right? And then it becomes an authentic choice. So I think that's the first thing that you have to put on the table, that individuals might be expected to try and understand what they were born with and try and take it somewhere that will be new. And then one thing that, of course, that raises is, of course, a big question is how does God respond to that, right? How does providence maybe change? How maybe things have to happen differently. Maybe things have to be reworked because, you've chosen a new direction. So it's all about, obviously the question, what does it mean to be authentic? And what does it mean to choose a path? And then, of course, if you're going to talk about the relationship to halacha, then, you're finding a way within that, okay? But the values of your path might be beyond. The Torah is wider than the Shulchan Aruch, right? And that's in the Torah, right? It's not even a question of inside or outside. The Torah is very wide.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so so that's great. So in our Avodat Hashem, our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it requires the full self, our full self. We can't suppress parts of the self in that avoda. So let me ask you, when there's a clash between halacha and ethics, we love to talk about the clash. Someone like Reb Sadia Gaon is going to say, then you've made a mistake. There is no clash between reason and halacha, between ethics and halacha. So you got to go back and reinterpret both of them or re-understand them until they work together. But I wonder, is that your answer? And what does that mean for those who aren't philosophers or aren't halachists or poskim? How can the average person who doesn't feel equipped to grapple with the huge ethical questions and halacha not outsource their problem to a posek all the time, but actually be a part of the moral development process, even though they don't feel fully equipped?
Yeah. Okay, so there's two issues there. So, I think the question of whether it's all in the Torah or it's not all in the Torah, which is like your first issue, kind of depends how you define the Torah. Sorry, that's like saying, is it all in philosophy, is it not? Well, depends what it is. If the Torah is halacha alone, then the Torah itself says that not everything is in halacha alone, right? Or you could say it differently, the halacha is an expression of the values of the Torah. And it's the expression that is obligatory, but it's not the full expression of all the values of the Torah, because you have a lot of values in the Torah that don't come out as particular mitzvot, or they come out of mitzvot that are not obligatory every day. So a person, I think, has to, obviously there will be tensions between the halacha and your ethics, but I think those are more on the sideline. The more interesting issues that come up all the time is, how do you plot a personal path, an authentic path in the Torah, within halacha? So I'll just throw out, like one unexpected important source is like the Khatam Sofer talks about when he's attacking Chassidut in Orach Chaim Kuf Tzad Zayin, he's attacking Chassidut. He said, what do I not like about Chassidut? He says, what I don't like is, he says, the whole point is to go beyond the Shulchan Aruch. What's really important is what you do beyond halacha, what you do within halacha, your own personal voice. That's the whole thing. The problem with Chassidut is they make the whole thing a social issue, right? Everybody does the same thing beyond, and when everyone's doing the same thing beyond, then you have to start again looking for something personal, right? Now, whether or not that's a good argument against Chassidut, it's a good argument, right? The argument is you need to do something which is personal, which infuses your understanding of halacha and goes beyond and takes the wider values of the Torah. And then when you're saying, the place of the rabbis, or what does a person do who doesn't feel they're learned enough? So, I actually really believe that it's really important to study. To put it this way, I think that something really fundamental about Judaism is learning, and that everyone is learning, and we're learning all the time. And that's because we really believe that study, even deep analytical study, if it's done properly, affects real life in action. And I really believe that the study of ethics, in that sense, is a bit like a part of the Torah. And if people feel that it doesn't affect their action, that's simply because they're not learning the right things, or they're not learning it the right way.
So it seems to me, in a sense, like you're speaking about halacha as a floor, not a ceiling, as it's been described, as kind of a minimalist approach. But it feels to me, what if we said, as some have, and I might even, that halacha actually includes our social justice responsibilities, right? That we are obligated to fight oppression and injustice, to pursue the yashar v'tov. And to do that is very encompassing. To take on social, political, moral issues in society is very demanding. It's hard to imagine going beyond halacha in that realm. So I wonder how you relate to that minimalist, maximalist question.
Right. So 100%, everything is within the halacha. But again, okay, so the question is, how do you choose? Some people will say, I'm going to concentrate on my family. Some people will say, I'm going to go out there to Africa, or I'm going to open a soup kitchen, right? And halakha teaches you about your obligations, but halakha, and for that matter, ethical philosophy, doesn't necessarily tell you there's only one path. You have to look at yourself and say, how do I do that? So again, I think, it's within halakha is a kind of framework, and the Torah is if you want to see, as it's often been compared to, that you swim in, you move around in. And you're taking those values that you're hopefully infused with, and then you're looking at yourself and you're looking at the world around you, and you're asking, how do I apply them? What is my path to apply them? But of course, that is what learning Torah is. That's what I'm personally quite invested a lot in, Bet Midrash and ethics, and study specifically those parts of the Torah that really affect how we, interact in the world. That's very central. And it's, often we study it, but we don't realize what we're studying. Sometimes you have to change the focus to realize that you're doing it all the time, right? And that's how it helps you, affect your life, that you make it real, right? When you realize what you're doing.
So what should the role of religious authorities be today when thinking about cultivating the moral intuitions and moral deliberations of those who approach them with questions?
Right. Well, I think the most important thing is to think about the word authorities, because often we think about rabbis as authorities, and I mean there's a certain kind of authority that people have. We all have authorities of types, but it's really, I think, rabbi is really about teachers, mentors, people you learn with or learn from or somehow. And so then, as authorities, I think people have very little influence and not that much importance either nowadays, or maybe ever, right, as an authority. I mean, you can decide halakha, but even then, people choose whether to follow it. The role of the religious role should be one of trying to show the expanse within the Torah, and the what's there, what's obligatory to everybody, what depends on circumstance, what's there for you to choose how to live by, and what you and how you can then use that to enrich your life. I mean, the assumption should be, as you said before, that not everyone has the same kind of access to knowledge or hasn't spent that much time, was not able to, right? And that you're supposed to, the help is really to access the riches, and for those riches to become practical in your life, you need to understand how to apply them for yourself, right? So that really should be, and I think that happens when you learn Torah the right, whatever the right way is, right? When you do it in a way that really touches the depths of your soul, it should happen.
So how do you understand the role of Yira Shemayim, or Avas Hashem, of awe of God or love of God, within this tension of individual expression versus communal norms? That to some degree we want to be a part of not separating from the norms of on the communal level. On another level, we're individuals, and sometimes we might be led to different places than communal norms. How do we juggle that as rabbis or as lay people?
Yeah. Well, there's different kinds of communal rules or norms, right? So sometimes you've got like the simple halachic, take an extreme case, right? I might enjoy staying up all night, but the halacha is that I have to say Kriyat Shema in the first 3 hours of the morning. And that's not going to be the best thing for everybody in every situation, right? And that's just a simple one that doesn't make me special or doesn't touch upon any moral, ethical challenge. But it just means that I have to, for some reason, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave that rule in the Torah. It could be because we need to think about those things in the morning, or it could be because there's something cosmic about the world, like the Ramchal and the Rambam would say different things there. But it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I have to get up in the morning, right? And then you've got communal, norms that are not part of halacha. The Gemara says, "Bimkom rina sham yehi tefillah," right? That in the place of singing, that's where you can daven. So it says an individual should always daven with the tzibur because, it's assuming that the singing that the tzibur does, the communal singing, that's not really davening. Really davening is what you're doing as an individual. But if you want to do it well, you're going to need help. You're going to need a context, right? And obviously, if you're going to need a context, then sometimes the context, real davening is what you're doing inside your heart. So sometimes it's going to go against, there's going to be that challenge. And that's one of the big communal challenges. How do you give free expression to people? Help, whatever's happening really helps their authentic selves, their personalities, their shorosh neshama. But we have to do it together, right? And that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. So following up on another question there, the issue of women's smicha, right? Like on the issue of women's smicha, someone might say, look, there's no real halachic objection. There's the Rambam, on Srara, but really it wouldn't be so difficult. But really, it's about Masorah, it's about communal norms, it's about, changes happening. So I'm not necessarily asking your view on that, and you're welcome to share that. But what kind of frameworks would you use to think about such a question like that? Because that is one of those issues, like something like gay marriage, which is something that is very pressing as a contemporary halachic ethical question, and in many ways goes beyond the realm of strict law.
Right. Well, so I just throw a few things into the field because this is something really to discuss at length.
Yeah.
So, one thing, one thing is that it's not just a question of communal norms in the present. It's a question of evolution as opposed to revolution. How do you be part of the word tradition is insufficient, right? How are you part of a continuum? Right? We have no right, or certainly we would be very flimsy in standing before God as individuals alone, right? And that what's special is that we can be part of, I don't want to use the word tradition because it's much deeper than that. It's a relationship that goes over, thousands of years. Now that, whenever you're dealing with something that's authentic and it's an old relationship, it's also has to be creative and has to evolve and it can't stay. So that's always the challenge in the communal setting. It's always the challenge, right? So the question is, how do you move ahead in such a way that you're even feeling the old Jewish style? It's right. It's natural. Like when you watch a film and you see a lot of pictures and you can't see where it breaks because there's a natural flow, right? And that's the real challenge. So both my mother and my wife are incredibly learned, maybe more learned than most rabbis I know. but it's not a question of whether they get smicha. It's a question of at what point people relate to them the same way they relate to me, right? So people will ask my mother and my wife questions the same way they ask me a question. That's what you need, right? That means something's happening, and sometimes giving it terminology, I think. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. No, let's not get into that question of whether other people are doing the right thing. But often putting the focus on the question of terminology is for sure missing the point, right? Whether a person thinks it's necessary, I'll leave that for others to think about. But it's not the real issue. Same thing with forms of davening, right? The question is, how do you feel the same thing? It's a very deep thing about feeling something, right? How do you experience it in the same way? You want to experience something that your great-grandparents experienced in the 21st century as an experience of the 21st century.
Okay, so should Rav Kook talks about evolution of halacha as being guided by hashgacha pratis, by divine providence, and then others take a more activist approach to it, that we should be educationally and through other means helping to move halacha to be as in line as possible with our contemporary sense of ethics. Do you take more of an approach that this is a natural evolution, or that we should actively be shapers?
Okay, so the easy thing is to say in between, but I actually mean something by in between, so I'll try to explain that. Right. So the way I understand things is, when a person acts naturally, authentically, in a certain kind of way, right, by their values, then things change. When one sets out to change things, one's acting from without. Now, when one's functioning from within, one's conceptions change, and what seems right will with time shift. And that you see all the time. And I think a great text for that is the Hakdama of the Ktsot HaChoshen. You have a lot of other sources as well, where you see poskim saying, I'm aware the way I think is different to how they thought in the past. That's fine. But if I set out to do it on purpose, then it won't be authentic. It won't be real. And I actually think that it won't just not be authentic, it won't work well. In something I wrote, I kind of brought examples from people like Wittgenstein and Quine. So that's, talking about, you have, say, Quine talks about a field of force where you have some kind of web, and, you can change things, but everything depends on something else. And where I take that to is that when you act within the web, right, and you're acting naturally as part of the web, things will fall into place, right? But when you try to impose your desire on something, then it tears, right? But that doesn't mean that you're not changing things. Anybody who's being, real understands that that's what it means.
So, shifting gears, I think I have two more questions for you. How do you approach futuristic questions in ethics, Jewish ethics, that are really paradigm shifts? When we look at questions like billionaires trying to fund immortality, or we look at artificial intelligence or genetic modification, I know these are very complex and they're all very different, but what should our orientation be? Because in some ways, those of us committed to halacha are naturally conservative because we're so past looking. It doesn't mean we can't also be progressive, some of us, but we're naturally conservative in our interest in preserving Torah. What framework should we bring to Jewish ethical questions that are futuristic?
Right. So I think there's obviously different types of questions. So some types of questions, halacha has almost nothing to say about. Okay, and that's perfectly good, because that doesn't mean that the Torah doesn't have anything to say, right? So one of the reasons halacha has rules, and if the rules don't respond to certain issues, then those rules might not have anything specific to say about those issues, and that's fine. That does not mean that the Torah doesn't have anything to say, right? So, if we have a conception of what a family is, the fact that we can bring children into the world in ways that in the past we couldn't, doesn't mean that we don't have a conception of a family. That's not only a halachic question. That's a sense of values that come out of a lot of areas of Torah. So that's on those types of questions. Now, there are other areas where halacha has a lot to say, not just Torah values, say, family, the sense of, for example, I just give you an example, I think that's something that's not clear nowadays, the importance of a father being a father, right? That's sometimes kind of lost nowadays. I'm not talking about whether if there isn't a father. I'm talking about the importance of fathering, right? That's something that sometimes people miss, right? And that you can see throughout Bereshit, right? That's not halacha so much, even though there are halachot about it. That's not the point. You have other things where halacha has a lot to say. So, for example, when you're talking about end-of-life questions, okay, so that this is like ethics less futuristic because it's really a problem now, then, deep analysis, ethical analysis of relationships between, say, consequentialism and deontology and all kinds of are really relevant. And you look in halacha and you take out of halacha a conception of what type of ethical issues are really important. Holiness of life or the importance of not taking life, right? These are very different nowadays. But when you get completely futuristic, right, then I think that a lot of Jewish theology is really, really important and people don't know it. So, take Derek Parfit, all kinds of analytical philosophy questions, which are very futuristic. And they bring Star Trek as an example when half of the theology of the Middle Ages was dealing with questions of Fisharut HaNefesh and things like that, right? And it's important to bring up those, even reincarnation, those are really important discussions, even if we're rationalists and we don't maybe go by those things, right? There's a lot of deep ideas there in Kabbalah, in Jewish thought, that can be really, really helpful for a lot of futuristic questions. So I'm really interested in that. Even, Kabbalah Ta'ari and Gilgulim, it sounds like completely out of our area, but it's very, very relevant to ask, how do you look at what an individual is, what a life is? What happens if a person forgets everything? What happens if he had a different body? Would you still say it's the same person, right? Can one person be a few people? Can you move on? And those questions are dealt with in an indirect way in Torah.
Yeah,
or maybe a direct way of a different generation.
Okay, very interesting. So, just one last question, and I want to honor your time here. So, and I don't know if this is a mathematical question, an epistemological question, but how we think about risk in pikuach nefesh, in saving life. What kind of risk can we take? We have the paradigm of soldiers, right? People put their lives at risk in Medinat Israel for the interest of saving a collective. Or there's living organ donors, those who are going to donate part of their liver or their kidney, putting their life at risk to save another life. Or in a very different sense, there's higher risk pregnancies. Should I abort this pregnancy or continue in childbirth? That's different because it's a potential life. It's not someone who's already alive. But how do you understand mathematically or epistemologically the extent to which we should take risk upon our lives for the sake of the life of another or for the collective lives?
Well, anyway, I'm no good at math, but I mean, there's a few interesting things out there that one can play with here to think about the subject. So, for example, Rav Kook has this interesting idea in his halachic writings that a person's allowed to sacrifice themselves for others. You're not allowed to sacrifice one person for another, but that person can. Okay, so I'm not saying everybody would agree, and in what situations would you say that, right? But that opens one's mind to altruistic issues here, right? And the question of whether you need to. Now, when you're looking at somebody else and you're looking at yourself, it's very, very different. Okay, and I think that brings us back to like where we started, the idea of your own path, your own mission in life, and to what extent do you choose your mission in life? And sometimes a person can say, I think this is my mission in life. Now, obviously, in certain situations, obviously you're not allowed to commit suicide. So it's not always possible to say, this is my life, I'm going to choose a direction. But yeah, sometimes it makes sense for a person to say, I'm going to go for it, right? Are you allowed to give your life, for example, for all kinds of things, is a big machloket between the medieval Ashkenazi world and the Rambam. And the Rambam thinks that anything you don't have to give your life for, you're not allowed to give your life for, right? But in the world of Sefer Hasidim, they thought about these things very differently. Yeah. And so even if we're not talking about giving a life, but risks and challenges, to health and the way you live, back to the mission, a personal mission, right, that we were talking about,
Yeah.
So there, I think, without talking about losing life, one can, use those ideas of the Sefer Hasid in that world and start saying, well, it could be that a person has to choose a way to live their life, right? You have to have your boundaries. There's a reason to draw a line in a certain place as far as not, going too far in risk, but it's fine. I think that risking one's life is not the central issue. Often there are risks within one's life that are much more central than the risk of a life, right? Most people are not about to go and risk their life, and it would be irresponsible in most cases for the people around them, and halachically dubious, because most people think like the Rambam that you're not allowed to, lose your life just for anything.
It's interesting.
Right?
One of the interesting paradigms there, sorry to cut you off, is if you look at Pidyon Shvuyim and like the Maharam or the case of one who says, "Don't save me," for the sake of the collective. I mean, that's kind of an interesting paradigm to play with, also. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And so Pidyon Shvuyim, right? People sometimes, I mean, there's a lot here, but people sometimes confuse danger to life with loss of life. Right? There's a lot of levels of danger to life. For example, we break Shabbat. It's not called breaking Shabbat, but we violate the rules of Shabbat over an extreme danger to someone's life. Right? That doesn't mean that you think they're going to die. You just think that they could die. Right? So I mean, you can look at it mathematically, but I'm not sure that in all generations they thought about it in probability terms. Right? It's just more a question of the way you look at it. But I think that the real challenges are not, the real risks we take in life and the real ethical challenges are not about loss of life. Yeah. They're like, if to take like Bernard Williams type of stuff, moral luck, that they're the risks we take with what our life is going to mean.
Right. Okay, so here's an example of that some of us grapple with over here. There are refugees and asylum seekers who are fleeing violent villages and end up here. And it is illegal for you to create a sanctuary for them where you hide them. Not obviously it's different than people in France or Germany hiding Jews in their basement. It's a different situation. But the basic idea is understandable that someone's life is at risk if they're sent back. Am I willing to be arrested? Break the law, put myself and my family at risk to support such a population? Right.
Right. And that's good because, you're not talking about loss of life. You're not risking your life, but you're risking a lot of things that you hold dear.
Yeah.
And, sometimes if you're not willing to risk certain things in life, then it's not clear that you've saved the rest because you've kind of given up on values that are going to define you. On the other hand, sometimes the reason why people become almost totally inactive is because they're making these calculations. So I would say that, the way I think about this, if I can be like, bring back to some kind of Dvar Torah, is how maybe Moshe Rabbeinu looked at himself before he was chosen before Hashem called upon him, right? He grew up in the house of Paro, and he, as soon as he grew up, he went out, killed someone, had to run away. Yeah. And it could be that he felt for years, I blew it. Right. I blew it, right? Had I been a bit calmer, and whatever, and I'd worked within the rules and said, okay, that's just bad, and I would have had an incredible effect as the viceroy or whatever job I'd have gotten in Egypt to save my brethren. And instead, I'm some shepherd in Midian, right? And I see that as maybe why Hashem calls upon him to take the people out. And you say, why did he say no? And I think part of the reason he might have said no is he said, that's not me. I blew it. And Hashem says, yeah, I want somebody who can't control themselves, who throws themselves into the ethical path, who then grows up and realizes that maybe it's not so wise, and Moshe Rabbeinu was always like that. So, that's just part of growing up. That's part of our maturity, that you can't see evil.
Yeah.
You can't see it, but on the other hand, you can't always deal with it.
Yeah.
Right. And it's that tension that brings Moshe Rabbeinu.
And that touches back on your point of different personalities. Like Kadosh Baruch Hu creates us all differently to harness different abilities and talents.
You're going to have to choose what kind of person you're going to be.
Yes. Okay. I feel like I could talk with you all day, but I want to honor your time. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Dov Rosen. Shkoyach. Thank you so much. Lots of
being with you. Take care.